Hello, everyone. This week, our activities are focused on providing academic instruction and improving academic outcomes for learners with autism. For this mini lecture, I want to specifically focus on how we can be intentional about what we teach, as well as how we can monitor our students' progress towards their learning objectives. So, most of us are familiar with writing learning objectives, right, or IEP goals and objectives. But I want to introduce this new concept called goal attainment scaling. And this is one way that you can modify or enhance your objectives so that you can ensure that your students are making gradual progress throughout the school year. All right, so as always, I've identified 3 objectives that I would like us to achieve by the end of this week's activities. The first is that you will be able to describe several methods that teachers can use to identify appropriate learning targets in their classrooms. Second, that you'll be able to take one of those targets, write a learning objective, and use this goal attainment scaling process to monitor the extent to which your instruction is effective. And then finally, um, we have an Ask the Expert assignment. Lucy is going to be teaching us about antecedent-based interventions. So after our class meeting on Thursday, I hope that you are able to understand when and why antecedent-based interventions might be effective for your student and how you can incorporate it into your instruction. So I want to bring us back to this concept of evidence-based practice framework. So throughout all of our courses in the special education teaching program, we very much abide by this framework. And the idea is that students who require specialized instruction oftentimes need their instruction to be individualized, right? They need their instruction to be oftentimes more explicit, right? And their consequences or benefits of their engaging in the target skill need to be very clear. So we operate according to this evidence-based practice framework. So as educators, our first job is to first determine what needs to be taught. What is it that our students need to learn? Right? What behaviors need improvement? What skills need to be taught? Right? That's the very first step that guides the rest of our instruction, is determining what it is our students need. Okay? Next, after we identify a target behavior or a target skill, we need to consider all the different interventions or strategies that might be appropriate to teach that target behavior or skill. And in this class, you will come out of this class with a number of different intervention tools or strategy tools that can be part of your strategy toolbox. So all of those Ask the Expert presentations that you all are doing and sharing with each other, all of those are evidence-based practices that should be or can be considered a possible intervention that you can use. In addition to our Ask the Experts, you also read about a number of different strategies. And again, all of those strategies are in your textbook, should be appropriate options for you, right? And then outside of this class, all of the methodological courses that you take as part of your program, and I'm specifically talking to the folks who are in our BS/MS program, all of those strategies are options for you, right? So don't limit yourself to just the interventions or strategies that we talk about in this class, though there are plenty that you can choose from, all right? Next, once you consider the different interventions that can work, you want to make sure that there is evidence to support its effectiveness. Now, fortunately, in our program, we have done that work for you. We only teach you strategies that actually do have solid research to support its effectiveness. Fourth, you need to choose that intervention, right, or a package of interventions, right? If you're going to combine different interventions, you choose your intervention or your strategies, and you need to develop a way to monitor student progress, right? And this is really important because you do not want to spend an entire year working on a target skill or goal, get to the end of the year and realize your student didn't learn it, right? And the way we can prevent getting to that point is that we're continuously monitoring student progress throughout the year. So that way, if you notice your student's not making progress because you're collecting data, you can see from the data that your student's not making progress, that should be a sign to you that you need to change your instruction, right? So monitoring is a really critical step of teaching, especially teaching students who have individualized instructional needs, right? And it's oftentimes the part that teachers have a difficult time implementing as part of their normal classroom practice, right? So it's something that we need to be very intentional about teaching you all to do in your classroom. So I'm going to teach you one way to do that using the school attainment scaling process. Because then the idea is once you've developed a way to monitor, you need to continually monitor progress. Okay, you need to monitor progress frequent enough to ensure that the treatment is working. And again, if the student's not making progress, you need to change the way that you are teaching, right? And you can change it in a number of ways. You might go back and decide, you know what, that target behavior or skill is not appropriate at this point, right? Maybe I chose the wrong skill, right? Or it could be that you have the right skill, right? But the intervention or strategy that you're using is not working. So let's consider other interventions or strategies. All right. Now, I want to do another refresher course on writing objectives. And I know for those of you who are in our special ed program, hopefully this should be second nature to you at this point. But this goal attainment scaling process that I'm going to introduce to you, it depends first and foremost on having a strong, solid initial learning objective. So let's do a quick review about what makes a strong instructional objective. All right. You want to make sure when you are writing individualized instructional objectives for your students that it is well operationalized, meaning the behavior is well defined, right? And that it is written in a way that you can measure progress. All right. In any IEP objective, we always follow this ABC, right? ABCs of objectives. You need to cite what the antecedent is. So what is the condition in which you want to elicit this behavior, right? Or what is the setting in which this skill or this, the skill or the behavior needs to be performed, right? So the antecedent could be a setting, right? Like during independent work time, student will, so forth. It could be with a particular person, right? Or particular group of people. So when approached by a familiar classmate, student will blank. Okay? Some objectives actually identify what support should be provided as a condition of the antecedent. So when given a daily schedule, the student will, right? You might even have an antecedent that provides something about structure of the classroom, right? So during highly structured activities, so during specific teacher-led activities, student will be able to blank, right? Or maybe you want them to do it in low structured activities, so such as recess, lunchtime, choice time. Like these are activities that don't have a lot of structure imposed upon them by the educator. Another antecedent could be, a specific subject area in school, right, or a specific time of day, right? So these are all different antecedents, but we want to make sure we specify when the behavior should occur, okay? The behavior, as always, we need to make sure that we are identifying behaviors and defining them so they are specific, right? So we know what we're looking for. It needs to be observable, meaning it's written in a way that if I were to see it, you could see it at the same time and we would agree, right? And it also needs to be measurable, right? Because that is the foundation of being able to progress monitor, is that we want to have some way of being able to measure this behavior that you've identified and defined, right? Lastly, we need to identify the criteria that the student is working towards, right? So essentially, at what point would we be comfortable saying the student has achieved this objective and they've mastered the skill, or at least acquired the skill to a point where we are comfortable saying that they definitely have it, right? So the criteria can be number of times, it could be the amount of time you engage in something, it could be a percent of accuracy or percent of opportunities. It could be a dimension of consistency. So he'll do it every day for a certain amount of time, right? It could, and you can also identify the specific data collection method from direct observation, from performance on worksheets, or performance on weekly tests. All right, so let's put this all together. So I'm going to make one up. So when this event occurs, so essentially it follows this formula. So when this event occurs, the student or learner will do this behavior at this rate or level of proficiency. Okay, so you want to make sure your objectives have an antecedent, a clear behavior, and a criteria that you can use to evaluate. All right, so let's see an example. So one of these is written well, right, in terms of being highly measurable and objective, and contains all three parts of a learning objective, and the other does not. Right? So I want you to think about which one of these is written appropriately. Okay, so instructional objective number 1, Josephine will appropriately work on her assignments. Goal number 2, at the start of the study period, Josephine will independently begin working on her assignment within 1 minute in 4 out of 5 study periods. All right, so I want you to take a second, think about which one of these examples actually contains all of the elements of an instructional objective that we just talked about. Right. I hope you all agree that it's example number 2. Right. It has a clear antecedent. Right. The antecedent is, in this case, a specific time period, right, at the start of a study period. Right. We've identified our learner, who is Josephine. The behavior is she's going to independently begin working on her assignment. Okay, that is the target behavior. We want her to start working on her assignment. Criteria is she needs to do this behavior within 1 minute of the period starting, right? In 4 out of 5 of the study periods. All right. All right, so here's another way to look at it. We broke it down this way. Antecedent is study period. Behavior is working on her assignment. The criteria is within 1 minute. And we want to make sure it's not just a good day and she just happened to do it, but we want to make sure she has some consistency with it and can maintain it. So within 1 minute in 4 out of the 5 study periods that we observe. All right. So now that we are all on the same page now about what is involved in a strong instructional objectives, let's talk about how we can layer on this goal attainment scaling process as a way to help us monitor our students' progress towards achieving the criteria that we set in our objectives. Okay, so this process involves, first and foremost, measurable and clear IEP goals and objectives, right? We have a clear data collection system, right? And we have our goal attainment scale, right, that aligns with the interventions or the strategies that we're using. Okay. So goal attainment scaling is probably a new term for many of you. So goal attainment scaling is simply a method of measuring student progress, right? And it's meant to be used in conjunction with IEP goals and objectives. Right? It's not meant to replace them. It's meant to be used with it. Okay? It actually is designed to support your instructional strategies and how you implement your instruction, right? And you need to use it in conjunction with whatever data collection procedures you're using. Right. Now, with goal attainment scaling, what you do is you consider different ranges of performance that the student might go through as they're working towards meeting that final criteria that you've established in your IEP objective, right? So when our students start, usually they're at level 1, right? The reason why they have an IEP objective on this target skill is because they're not doing that skill yet, right? So they're all usually at level 1, meaning they are demonstrating this target skill much less than what we expect from a student of their same age, their same level, right? So essentially, level 1 is what they're currently doing, their present level of performance, okay? And then level 2 is an initial objective, so something that's a little bit better, making so slight progress towards your final objective. And the secondary objective is just a little bit more progress, right? The fourth level is the actual criteria that you set in your objective, right? And the fifth one is if they can exceed the criteria, right? So you've essentially taken your IEP objective and scaled it and identified steps that the student can achieve that will get them eventually towards their final objective. All right. So when we're going to use this process, make sure you review the IEP goals to make sure that they contain all the essential elements of an IEP objective, that they're highly measurable and observable. Right? Step 2 is determining where the student is at currently. So take some baseline data. At what level of proficiency does the student engage in this skill, if at all? Okay. And the present levels might be that they don't do it at all, right? But you want to make sure that you have some data to demonstrate their initial starting point. Okay. Based on that initial starting point, you would then break the major objective into almost like sub-objectives. Okay. And then you provide your instruction and you evaluate continuously. All right. So let's talk about this. So step 1 is always to review the IEP goal of an objective. So you're going to make sure, so this is something that can happen during the IEP meeting, right? Because during IEP meetings, you are always reviewing student IEP goals with other teachers, the student's other teachers or related service personnel, parents, and students, especially if you're working with older students. They are oftentimes part of the IEP meeting and should be part of the IEP meeting whenever possible. Right? When you're developing your IEP goals and objectives, you want to make sure that anything that you include is a priority goal or a priority skill. Right? It needs to be something that can be worked on for the entire year. Right? And I'm going to say it again, it needs to be observable and measurable. And the whole team needs to be on the same page. So the family, the educational team, the students must agree that this is a meaningful, important skill to be working on for the year. Okay. Now, sometimes you might get a student who transfers in which you did not write the IEP, right? So in that case, you might need to make modifications to IEP goals as needed, okay? This would oftentimes require you to convene an IEP meeting, right? If you are actually making modifications or creating addendums to your IEP, okay? Once you have solid IEP objectives, again, you determine the student's present level of performance, all right? You want to make sure that the present levels are defined and in a way that is highly observable and measurable. You want to make sure it's accurate, right? That you have a clear data collection procedure that you're using that you can consistently use throughout the school year to measure this behavior, right? You want to make sure that your baseline measures actually reflect the true performance of that target behavior, right? You want to make note of any prompting strategies or any supports that student needs or that may be in place that might affect the baseline levels of performance, right? And lastly, you want to make sure that you've selected a data collection system that is easy to collect but will produce meaningful results. All right. Now let's talk about actually developing a goal attainment scale, right? So I'm going to include a PDF or a Word copy of this on our Canvas site, so you all have a copy of it. So as always, what you're going to do is you're going to identify the present level of performance. Identify the present level of performance. So this is the baseline, and you're actually going to write it in there, okay? And then the next thing you do is you write the annual objective. So what have you decided as an IEP team would be an appropriate criteria for that student to be working towards? Okay. Once you have those two, I would go back to the initial objective, right? And then fill in the secondary objective. Right? So how can the student incrementally make progress towards that annual objective? And then the fun one is level 4, where you have a student who exceeds the annual goal, right? So we can think about scaling our objectives across different dimensions, depending on what your target skill is and the criteria that you've set. Right? If you have an objective in which you are trying to increase the frequency, so the amount of times the student demonstrates the skill, you could think about scaling across frequency. Right? So I'm looking here at this first column, right? So currently the student performs the skill 0 out of 10 opportunities, okay? So let's say this is initiating conversation with a peer, okay? So let's say every snack period, right, you have a break for snack, the students have an opportunity to sit together, right? And you're observing like how many times the student initiates a conversation, right? Right now, he never does it. Our annual objective says, you know what, we really want him to do it in 6 out of 10 snack periods, right? That we would like to see him get there, right? And do it 6 out of 10 times, right? But we need to identify incremental steps that will gradually get him there. So our level 1 is like, okay, well, let's have first say level 1 is 2 out of 10. Level 2 will be 4 out of 10. Level 3, which is our annual objective, is 6 out of 10. And if you were to exceed that criteria, it would be 8 out of 10, right? So this is just kind of the cherry on top. Now, sometimes people write IEP objectives with prompts, right? That they'll be able to engage in that target behavior given certain prompts. Okay, so you might scale according to the intensity of prompts that are needed. So right now, in order to say respond to a peer's request for a snack item, right? It requires the teacher to do a full physical prompt. I have to hand over hand get that item and release it to the peer upon his request, right? But our goal is that we eventually want our student to respond to a peer request with just a gesture and a visual prompt, right? So I'm going for something that is a really intense prompt to something that is more natural and more subtle, okay? All right, so we're going to scale according to this, right? So the first level might be that we're going to require partial physical prompts. So I don't need a full hand over hand do this, right? But I just need to bump his elbow, right? Once he can do that consistently, I'm going to use gestural prompts only. So I'm going to point to my friend, okay? Now, level 3, I'm going to use gesture and visual prompts, right? Because that's what's stated in my objective. And then finally, I just want him to do it with visual prompts only, okay? All right, now let's look at the context here. We can also scale according to the context. So we can think about different contexts in which a student is required to perform the skill, right? Right now, he does not perform it frequently at home, or he does it inconsistently at home. We're eventually going to get him to do it in general ed science, which is a hard class for him, okay? So first, we're going to do it in the self-contained classroom, and then the gen ed math class, which is easier, and then the gen ed science class, and then in the gen ed language arts class, right? You can also scale according to the person involved, all right? So right now, he doesn't do this skill with anybody, right? But eventually we want him to do it with his familiar peers in the natural setting, so in his classroom, right? But we can work up to that by saying, well, right now he's not doing it at all, right? But let's work on it during our one-on-one counseling sessions, okay? Once he masters that, we're going to teach him to do it with his peers in a small group, right? And then eventually get to his final objective, which is performing with peers in a natural setting. And then the cherry on top, if he exceeds that goal, is that he's doing it with unfamiliar peers in the natural setting. All right. So step 4 is that you actually start teaching, right? You start teaching, and you're going to use this goal attainment scale to evaluate the effectiveness of your instruction or intervention, right? You're seeing whether or not they're making progress on that scale. All right. So let's actually use an example here. So Sam is a 9th grade student with autism who is included in general ed classrooms for most of the day. Sam's mom tells his teacher that she is worried that she's worried about the lack of close friendships in his life. He spends most of his free time alone or with his younger brother, but Sam has expressed interest in meeting new people. Sam's teacher says that a lot of Sam's peers try to interact with him, but Sam doesn't know how to respond. So a paraprofessional in his general ed classroom took data for 5 days to assess his present levels. Peers initiated with Sam over 30 times, but Sam would just smile or laugh instead of responding verbally. Sam's mom, his teacher, his paraprofessional, and therapist, they all met and chose to the following annual goal as a priority for the year. Right? So they write this objective. When a peer initiates conversation, Sam will respond and then continue that conversation by asking a follow-up question for 80% of the opportunities over 3 consecutive days. All right. So the antecedent or the context is if a peer approaches Sam to initiate a conversation, right? The behavior is responding to that peer initiation and continuing the conversation. So there are 2 behaviors here we need to be keeping track of, right? Whether or not he responds to the peer by answering a question, right, for instance, and then continuing the conversation, right? And the criteria we're working towards is 80% of the opportunity. So 80% of the times where a peer initiates a conversation over 3 consecutive days. All right. So let's put it into our goal attainment scale. So our present level of performance is our objective, but you'll notice that instead of the annual criteria, we're writing in our present level criteria. So what he's presently doing. So when a peer initiates conversation, Sam will respond and then continue a conversation by asking a follow-up question for 0% of opportunities over 3 consecutive days, okay, across 3 peers. All right, so that's where he's currently at. What we'd like to get him to go is that he will engage in this behavior for 80% of opportunities over 3 consecutive data collection periods. All right, so now our job is to figure out what are incremental steps that Sam can make towards this objective. So level 1 might be that in going from 0% of opportunities, right? We are scaling on, let's see. Oh, we're scaling here on the setting, right? So when given a structured conversation time, Sam will respond to a conversational attempt by a peer and then ask a follow-up question with a visual script and a verbal prompt, right? So we are here identifying a more structured time as our context or antecedent, and we're also providing prompts. We're saying he has a visual script as well as a verbal prompt to support him, right? So this is still highly supported at level 1. Level 2, we're still in our structured conversation, right? But we no longer have the visual or the verbal prompt. He's only using the visual script, right, for 80%. Okay. Now, and then after he achieves that, we're going to work towards eliminating that visual script. So given a structured conversation time, Sam will independently respond to a conversational attempt by a peer and ask a follow-up question for 80% of opportunities. So now he's doing this independently. He does not have a visual script or a verbal prompt. All right. And then exceeding the annual goal is when he's presented with a conversational attempt from a peer. So a peer comes and initiates a conversation. Sam will respond and then continue the conversation by asking a follow-up question for 80% of opportunities over 3 consecutive days. So that is the objective in level 3. But what makes it exceeding the annual goal is that he's going to do it and demonstrate this with 3 different peers. Okay, so he's going to generalize it across peers. So oftentimes we can think of this level 4 as our generalization goal. Now we need to make sure that when we are putting our objectives into the goal attainment scaling process, that each step is measurable, right? We need to make sure that the difficulty is appropriate for that level and that it's equidistance. So what do I mean by equidistance? I mean that the improvements from level 1 to level 2 are essentially similar to the improvements we would expect from level 2 to level 3. Okay. Alrighty. So that is all I have for you in terms of goal attainment scaling. We'll have an opportunity to practice that, and you can ask me questions during our class meeting. In preparation for the class meeting, you have plenty of readings to do. You have the textbook reading chapter 4, an article by Josh Plavnik and his colleagues, and an article that I wrote with some of my colleagues on academic skills. All right, you've watched our mini lecture, and just make sure you submit your knowledge check as well as your discussion role before class. All right, thanks all. Bye.